Professor Michael McCloskey. He's from our own cognitive science department with a joint appointment in the psychology and brain sciences department, the mind brain institute. I've seen the mind brain guys here. She's one of the next ones. And also in the neuroscience department at the university. His interests are generally in mental representation of spatial concepts and also lexical entities related to spatial concepts. And his work, especially on people with, I would call them very interesting disorders, which affects one aspect of their mental processing of spatial information, lexical information, or others. And today he's going to talk to us about the interactivity process.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk here. This may be a little bit different in topic and approach from what you usually hear, but I hope you'll find it interesting. One very obvious point about cognition, especially language, is that cognitive processes typically involve multiple levels of representation. So if you just think for a moment of what goes on, say when you're writing, if you have in mind a message to write and you have a word that you want to express, you may activate a lexical semantic representation that expresses the meaning of that word. And from that representation, you may access an abstract lexical representation or lexeme. And in turn, that may help you to activate the letters that make up the spelling, again at an abstract level, which we'll call graphemes. From that, in turn, you may access specific letter shape representations appropriate to however you're going to write the word, say in lowercase print or uppercase script or whatever. And after probably several additional levels of representation, you may eventually produce the appropriate writing movements. So one question that comes up with any type of process that involves multiple levels of representation is what we can call an interactivity question, and that is how do these different levels of representation interact with one another? On the one hand, we may have a strictly feed-forward architecture in which each level communicates information to the subsequent level and information flows in a purely forward fashion, sort of the way I just described the process of writing a word. On the other hand, the architecture may be much more interactive, such that adjacent levels, perhaps even non-adjacent levels, influence each other in a reciprocal fashion, such that things going on at one level may influence not only later but also earlier levels. In this type of architecture, you might have something like a network settling down to a stable state over multiple iterations. So I'm going to present two studies today that address very specific issues falling under this general heading of interactivity. One of them involves writing single words, and this is a study I did with Paul Macaruso, a former postdoc, and Brenda Rapp, my colleague in the cognitive science department. And the second study involves reading sentences and text, and this one I also did with Brenda Rapp. Now, both of these studies are going to involve taking a cognitive neuropsychological approach to the issues. And that means that we're going to try to understand how some normal aspect of cognitive processing works by studying cases in which the cognitive system is broken down in some way. So we're trying to work backward from the impairment to see what it can tell us about how the system is put together normally. So let me start with the question of interactivity in written word production. I'm going to focus on one particular part of this larger architecture here, and that is the relationship between orthographic lexemes, the whole word representations, and their constituent letters or graphemes. And what I want to ask is whether the flow of information is feed-forward or whether there's reciprocal interaction between the levels. And the way I'm going to try to look at this is through a study of a brain-damaged patient whose initials are CM. CM was a university professor until he had a stroke at age 59, so if you're getting up there like me, you should watch yourself. He had extensive left hemisphere damage as a result of that stroke. He had a number of problems consequent to the stroke, but one of them involved spelling. He was an excellent speller prior to the stroke, but was very impaired at spelling afterwards, and that's what we're going to be looking at. His spoken language production was also impaired. He was not able to speak very well, although that's not particularly relevant to this study. What's more relevant is that his single word comprehension, both for spoken and written words, was still intact, so he could understand when words were said to him, for example. And that's important because the way we tested his spelling was to ask him to write words to dictation. We said a word to him like pencil, and he was just supposed to write it down. Very straightforward task. Over a period of a few years, we presented him almost 3,800 words to spell. He didn't seem to get tired of this, although we did after a while. He made almost 1,700 errors, and that gives you an error rate of 45%. If we look at his spelling errors, they're kind of a mixed bag. There are cases where he would substitute one letter for another or get letters out of order, and often the responses were much more mixed up even than the examples I've shown you here. Something I'll come back to is that occasionally he wrote the wrong word. So in those last two examples, his response is a word, but it's just not the word he was asked to spell. There are two phenomena that we saw in his performance. One I'm going to call the letter persistence effect, which is going to require some explanation. And the second is the lexical errors, which is this tendency to write the wrong word. And what I'm going to argue is that when these are taken together, we can use them to develop an argument for a reciprocal interaction between the level of orthographic lexemes and graphemes. And particularly here, what I've already mentioned. Okay, so what do I mean by the letter persistence effect? Well, we noticed that CM spelling errors included over 3,000 what I'll call letter intrusions. And these are quite simply letters that appeared in his written response that did not occur in the correct spelling of the word. So for example, when he spelled skirt, substituting an N for the R, the N is an intruded letter by this definition. Similarly, when he stuck in an extra R in company, that's also an intruded letter. So these are things that can be either substitutions for a correct letter or insertions, as in these examples. Now, what was interesting is that we noticed it appeared to be the case that when he intruded a letter into one of his spelling responses, that letter tended to have been present in earlier responses, the immediately preceding responses he'd made. So let me just look at this a little more systematically. Here's an example of a spelling error in which the word ribbon was dictated to him and he wrote big. Now, of course, there are several things wrong with that response, but one of them is that it includes an intruded letter G. There's no G in the correct spelling of ribbon. And now I'm going to call that trial E, by the way, to mean error trial. So anytime I'm focusing on a particular error, I'm going to call that the trial E. So then I'm also want to look now at what happened on the immediately preceding trials, E-1 through E-5. And here are his stimuli and responses for those trials. And what you can see is that there were G's in several of the preceding responses. So we can actually score each of those responses as to whether it included the intruded letter G or not. And we can see that 3 of the 5 responses did. And what we did was, given that it seemed like these intruded letters were often present in earlier responses, we systematically counted this. So we can look over all 3,000 and some intruded letters for each of the 5 preceding trials. How likely is it that the intruded letter was present in the prior response? So for the immediately preceding trial, the intruded letter was present almost 45 or 45% of the time. Yeah?
In the trial E, what do you consider an intrusion, only G or even B?
B is not. B and I are not intrusions because those are letters that occurred in the correct spelling. They're out of order. They're not in the correct sequence necessarily. They're not in the correct sequence. But what I'm looking at is letters that are not in the correct spelling at all, but turned up in his response. Okay? Yeah. So when he produced an intruded letter like the G, 45% of the time that letter had appeared in the immediately preceding response. And if we then look at the earlier responses, you can see that it's still fairly likely that the letter was present in those earlier responses, although the probability is monotonically decreasing down to about 34% when we look 5 trials back. Now, what this possibly suggests is that in some sense, producing a letter creates a likelihood for that letter to intrude later on. In other words, perhaps the G in big is in some sense coming from these earlier responses. But of course, we can't conclude that just on this basis. Let me go back here. I'll get to that in a second. Because obviously, if I take any letter in a list of spelling responses and look for in earlier responses, I'm going to find it sooner or later. I'm going to find it with some likelihood. So what we need to know is whether there really is any causal relationship between the occurrence of the letter in the earlier responses and the occurrence on the trial E that we're interested in. Because it could very well be that the occurrence of the G in flag or rag or tuggle has nothing to do with its later occurrence in big. So we're going to have to try to figure out a way to estimate the likelihood of finding the letter that's intruded on earlier trials by chance. And the idea was that we could estimate that by looking at other responses that were not in the immediate vicinity of the error. So for example, if we want to know whether the G in flag has any relationship to its occurrence in big, then we can ask, well, how likely are we to find a G in words that are, say, 20 trials earlier than the big response or 20 trials later? Because if the occurrence in the immediately preceding trials has nothing to do with the occurrence on the error trial, then we should be just as likely to find a G in some of those distant trials as we should be to find it immediately preceding. So we can go and find control words of the same length as the word that we're looking at. So if we want to know, we have on trial E-1 a 4-letter response. What's the likelihood of finding a G in one of those responses? Let's look at all the other 4-letter responses that are not in the vicinity. And similarly for the other responses like bishop, look at other 6-letter words and so forth. Okay. And so we did this for each of these intruded letters, for each of the 5 immediately preceding responses. We found all of the relevant control words, counted up how many times the letter that was intruded was there, and it was ugly, but anyway. So we can score these, but then do it for over all the trials that we have, and we find a very stable estimate of the chance likelihood, about 30 to 31%. So that is lower than the proportions that we're observing. Yeah?
I'm sorry, the control experiment was right after Cave also came ribbon, but he said it correctly?
No. Suppose we've given him a list of 50 words to spell, okay, and on trial 30, you have ribbon, he writes it as big. And we notice that on trial 29, he's written flag. And the question is, does that G in flag have anything to do with writing it on big? Well, let's look not in the vicinity of trial 30, like on trials 1 through 20 or on trials 40 through 50, and look at other 4-letter responses there and see whether they include a G or not.
This is just
Okay.
5 consecutive responses and it's outside of that.
Outside of that range, yes. Actually, it was outside of the range 5 before to 5 after. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so what we can do, I can show you this graphically. The top line there is for trial E-1 on the far right to E-5 on the left, the proportion of times that the intruded letter was present in that preceding response. And then the lower line is the estimate of the proportion expected by chance, computed the way I just told you. Uh-huh.
Is there a reason you looked at his responses rather than the stimulus?
Yes, that's a very good question, too. We did analyze for stimulus or response, and the phenomenon is entirely confined to the responses. So if we look at letters that were in the correct spelling but he did not produce, they had absolutely no tendency above chance to intrude into a subsequent response. Okay, so let's see if I can go back. Okay, so for example, in tunnel, which he spelled with 2 G's instead of 2 N's, the likelihood of an N occurring in the next response was absolutely at chance. Okay? Whereas if we looked at the probability of a letter that was not in the stimulus but was in the response, then it intruded above chance rates. Very good question.
So am I understanding it right that you pick a letter that's an intruder?
Correct.
And you look at a position where it has been inserted incorrectly, and the statistics of the 5 words behind it are in the first column, 30%.
Right.
And take some other random point and look at the 5 responses.
No, not just other. No, not just some other random point. We would take for flag, we would take all the other 4-letter responses that were outside that zone. Yes, and then for town, we take all the other 4-letter responses. For bishop, we take all the 6-letter responses and so forth. So for every response there, on E-1 and so forth, there are probably 5 or 6 on average other responses we're looking at. Yeah. Okay. Good.
And these graphs are averaged over all the intruding letters or just G?
No, all the 3,000 intruded letters. Yes, that's right. That's right. This is collapsed over a whole bunch of stuff. Okay, so the point is that even going back as far as 5 preceding trials, the likelihood is greater than chance that a letter that occurred in an earlier response will turn up later on. And when I show you these effects subsequently, what I'm going to do is show you a single line where I've just subtracted the actual proportion from the proportion expected by chance. And that's done here. And so now 0 would be a chance likelihood, and anything above that suggests an actual real effect of the preceding letters. Okay. What we think is probably going on is something like the following. So suppose you're writing the word pig, you activate the lexeme for pig and the PI and G graphemes and so forth. And then, though, after you've written that word, you really need to deactivate these representations so they don't get in the way later on, so that when you next are writing something else, only the representations relevant to that next word will be activated. However, what we think is that for CM, because of his brain damage, at the level of the grapheme representations, these are not being deactivated normally. They are abnormally persisting in an activated state. So that even after he's written pig, for example, the P, I, and G graphemes may retain some activation. Then when the next word comes along, say set, activates its lexeme and graphemes. At the grapheme level, we have not only the SE and T activated, but some other things hanging around from before, and that may lead to a letter from an earlier response being intruded into this subsequent response. And that's why I'm calling it a letter persistence effect. These I could call the grapheme persistence effect. These graphemes are persisting when they should be going away. Now, we have evidence that this is an orthographic effect, not a phonological effect. It's not, say, that when we dictate the word to him, the phonological representation is hanging around and causing trouble later on. There's also evidence that it is occurring at the level of the grapheme representations and not something subsequent like allograph representations or motor plans or so forth. So I'm not going to go into the evidence there. I'm just going to ask you to take my word for it, although you're welcome to ask me later if you like. Okay, so that's the first phenomenon, this tendency for letters to intrude on subsequent responses, perhaps because they're remaining activated. Now let me look at the lexical errors, which is the tendency to write an incorrect word. About a third of his spelling errors were in fact correct spellings of the wrong word. So for example, writing sold as cold, or vine as vain, or carpet as compute. Okay. Now, in thinking about these errors, we again have an issue of chance to consider, because of course you could produce a lexical error by chance. In other words, for reasons having nothing to do with the fact that the sequence of letters in the response happens to be a word. So for example, something like the following might happen if you're given the word set and say the S is not really strongly activated and there's a P hanging around being activated. You may come up with pet, which happens to be a word, but the process leading to that error had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that pet happened to be a word. It could just as well have been fet or something like that. On the other hand, what I'll call true lexical errors could occur in such a way that you're producing the word for reasons that are related to the fact that it's a word. And particularly in this case, we could have the wrong lexeme getting activated for one reason or another. So perhaps when the word set is dictated, somehow the word, the lexeme for pet gets activated, and that leads to the production of the word. So this is what I'll call a true lexical error, where it's occurring because a lexical representation of the wrong word is getting activated. All right, after all that, I'm ready to start telling you what the argument's going to be. What I'm going to argue is in 3 steps. First, that at least some of these lexical errors that he's making are true lexical errors. They're not all just occurring by chance. Some of them are occurring because the wrong lexeme is getting activated. The second step is that these true lexical errors do show this letter persistence effect. When he writes the wrong word, it tends to include letters from prior responses, and they do so at an above chance rate. And finally, that this persistence effect evident in the true lexical errors implies the reciprocal interaction between these 2 levels of representation. And it's going to take some time to get through these, so let's start. All right, so in order to show that at least some of these lexical errors are true lexical errors, we need to show that they're occurring more often than expected by chance, that he's making more lexical errors than you would expect him to make if something was just randomly happening at the level of graphemes that happened to produce an error by chance. But it's not entirely clear how to go about this. If you look at these examples of lexical errors, they occur in lots of different ways, and it's not clear how we would estimate the likelihood that, say, carpet could become compute by chance, or vine could turn out to be vein by chance, in other words, for reasons having nothing to do with the fact that compute and vein are words. So what we did as an initial analysis was to limit the analysis to a particular type of error, errors where his incorrect response involves substituting either one or two incorrect letters for correct letters. So in the two lexical examples, for example, grim being written as grin, an N has been substituted for the M, and in blind written as blank, an A has been substituted for the I, and a K has been substituted for the D. And what our idea was here is that figuring out what the chance likelihood of these errors occurring might be a little more tractable than considering the whole set. Now, in this analysis, we're going to consider not only the substitution errors that became words, like grin and blank, but also cases where one and two letter substitutions occurred that did not produce words, like jeep being written jeek. Altogether, considering both the lexical and non-lexical errors, there are 449 of these errors, and they break down as follows. 191 of them were lexical errors, 191 of them were words, like grim becoming grin. 258 were not. So 43% of them were words. And the question then is this proportion of 43% greater than what we'd expect by chance? So, well, how can we figure out what the likelihood is of getting an error by getting a word by chance with a substitution? So what we did was for each lexical and non-lexical error, in other words, for all 449 of those, we tried to estimate how likely it was to come out as a word by chance if just some random substitution had happened at the grapheme level. And so we asked what substitutions might have occurred, and we did this based largely on letters that were in prior responses. So let me explain. So take the error grim coming out as grin. We determined that the letters that could have occurred as substitutions were B, D, F, K, N, R, T, and W. And this was mostly because these were letters that occurred in the immediately preceding responses. There are a few other constraints on this too. I think I'm not going to go into them though. Okay, so then we said, well, if these letters were kind of available to occur as substitutions, maybe because they were remaining active after prior responses, then what would have happened if one of them was substituted for the N? Okay, so we could have gotten then grib if the B had been substituted, and so forth and so on. So these are the 8 substitution errors that might have occurred if that M had been substituted. And 3 of those turn out to be words, grid, grin, and grit. So that if these are the errors that could occur by chance for reasons having nothing to do with them being words, then we would expect that for this substitution, about 37.5% of the time it will come out as a word by chance. Okay. Well, we then did that for all 449 of these errors. So for each of those errors, we had a likelihood that it would come out as a word by chance. And that was true for both the lexical errors, the ones that did come out as words, and the non-lexical errors, those that didn't. And the average proportion here was 0.23 that we got over all of these, whereas what we actually observed was that 43% were actually words. But this isn't quite good enough. We need to know, given this set of proportions, is there any reasonable chance that we could have gotten 43% as words just by accident? So we did Monte Carlo simulations where we generated a distribution of number of lexical errors expected by chance, and this is what we did. For all 449 of these proportions, 37.5 for one, 23 for another, 18, 64, and so forth, we stepped through these and just randomly determined whether it was going to come out as a word or non-word. So for something with a 0.38 probability being a word, 38%, it had a 38% chance of coming out as a word. And we did that for all 449 of those, and so then we got some number of them that had come out as words in our simulation. Then we did this again, and we did it 1 million times. And so that generated a distribution of how many in these 449 would come out as words. And this is the distribution here. You probably can't read these numbers on the axis, but that's okay, because I'll tell you the mean of that distribution is 102, so that on average, in those 449 errors, based on our estimates, 102 of them should have come out as words. The maximum in 1 million runs of the simulation was 140. And the number we observed, though, as I've already mentioned, was 191. So by this argument, the chance of obtaining 191 of these errors coming out as words, if they were all just occurring by accident, is less than 1 in 1 million. Okay. So we are concluding then on that basis that at least some of these errors are true lexical errors, where it's not just something happening at the grapheme level with nothing to do with the lexeme level, but rather at least some of these errors involve activating the wrong lexeme. Okay. So that's the first step in the argument. The next step is then to say, well, do these true lexical errors show this letter persistence effect, the tendency to include letters that have occurred in previous responses? Okay, so in other words, when we have an error like blind coming out as blank, if that's a true lexical error occurring because the lexeme blank was activated, is it more likely than expected by chance that that A and K occurred in earlier responses? Well, a first cut to look at this is to look at what the persistence effect is just for these lexical errors that are 1 and 2 letter substitutions. And you can see there is a nice, clear persistence effect there. So that suggests that in this set of lexical errors, there is a systematic tendency for letters to intrude from prior responses. This is not quite good enough, though, because these errors we can't determine are all true lexical errors. We could think of these as perhaps a mixture of true lexical errors that came about through activating the wrong lexeme and chance lexical errors that occurred for other reasons. And perhaps then the entire effect here, the persistence effect, is being driven by the chance lexical errors. Perhaps there's no effect for the true lexical errors, but we need to know if there is. One way we can determine that is to compare the magnitude of the persistence effect here with the non-lexical errors that were substitutions. So these errors, like Jeep being spelled as Jeek, these errors presumably did come about through things going wrong at the grapheme level, and so those errors give us an estimate of the size of the persistence effect expected on the basis of that type of error. If these lexical errors are a mixture of some of that type and some true lexical errors that don't show the effect, then clearly the size of the persistence effect should be smaller for the lexical errors than for the non-lexical errors. In fact, say if about half of the errors are true lexical errors and half are chance lexical errors, the persistence effect should be about half as large for the lexical errors as for the non-lexical errors. And in fact, our best estimate is that about 60% of these lexical errors are true lexical errors. So if we compare here, the thick or the long dashes show the persistence effect for these 1 and 2 letter substitutions like Jeep to Jeek, where they were not lexical errors. And you can see that the persistence effect is just as large for the lexical errors as for the non-lexical errors. So something that came out as a word was just as likely to have letters from previous responses as something that didn't. The lower line is just the maximum size of the persistence effect that we could have expected from whatever chance lexical errors were mixed in with the true lexical errors. Okay. So far, so good? All right, so that's the second step. Now, that argument, I think, is pretty sound, but it does rest on a lot of assumptions. So I want to very briefly give a second argument for these 2 points. And this argument relies on what I'll call complex lexical errors. Some of his lexical errors were not nice and simple substitution errors that would, you think, have some chance of occurring by accident. Some of them were very complex errors where lots of things had to go wrong in order to produce it. So like few being written as feature or machine as improve. Now, to have these various kinds of errors occur for reasons that have nothing to do with the fact that machine or feature, that improve or feature is a word, seems very unlikely, right? So to have something go wrong at the grapheme level for few to come out as feature, you somehow have to lose the W and you have to get an A-T-U-R-E, and it has to happen to spell a word. So what I would argue is that these errors are very unlikely to have occurred by chance. They're almost certainly due to activation of the wrong lexeme. So if the errors that occur for activation of the wrong lexeme don't show this persistence effect, then these complex lexical errors should show little or no persistence effect. In fact, though, they show a nice, robust persistence effect. So even these really unusual errors like writing machine is improved, the intruded letters in those responses are likely, much more likely than expected by chance, to be present in the earlier responses. Yes?
Maybe you look at the number of edits that it would take you to get from one to another and see if that correlates with the chance of the lexical error?
Yeah, the way we selected these as complex lexical errors is based on how many edits they would require. So these require, I think, at least 4 edits, something like that. And then we just said that that's unlikely to produce a word. We didn't go any further than that. Okay, so this is, I'm just binning those, right, and arguing that this is a category of errors that's unlikely to have occurred by chance. I don't really know exactly how to estimate chance for these. So the earlier analysis was where I thought we had some possibility of coming up with reasonable estimates of chance. Here, I'm just relying on our intuitions that it's not very likely here. Okay. Okay, so that's the first 2 steps. Now let me try the third one here, which is briefer, mercifully. And I want to consider an example here. So what I'm trying to, sorry, I may have gone too quickly here. What I want to argue now is that the fact that these true lexical errors show a persistence effect requires us to assume that there's this reciprocal interaction between the grapheme and lexeme levels. So let's consider this just as an example. On trial E, the word arm being written as amber, and the preceding trial in this case was bench being written correctly. So this is a lexical error, and it includes 2 letters from the prior response, the B and E. Now, let's assume for argument that this is a true lexical error. It occurred because the amber lexeme got activated, and let's assume that the B and E appear in that response not by accident, but because they were present in the prior trial. So this is what we're trying to explain, true lexical errors that systematically include prior response letters. Okay, so what we would guess would have happened is that bench, the previous stimulus was dictated, everything worked out real well there, but then at least some of those letters, the B and E at least, remained activated when the word arm was dictated. And somehow out of that, amber came. And since this is a true lexical error, we're assuming that the amber lexeme got activated and in turn activated its letters and so forth. And so the question is, how can we explain how this amber lexeme could have gotten activated? If we try to do this within an entirely feed-forward architecture where we have information flowing from lexical semantic representations to lexemes to graphemes and not in the other direction, it's going to be very difficult to do. So when arm is dictated, we activate semantic representations and then lexemes. We might then expect to get some activation of lexemes other than arm, but they should presumably be lexemes that are semantically related, like leg or hand or something like that. If we assume that maybe phonology had some role to play, we could get phonologically similar, lexemes for phonologically similar words activated. But I've already told you that we have good evidence that this persistence effect is not occurring at any phonological level. So that is not going to get us anywhere with trying to understand why amber is activated given that it shares letters with the previous response. So what we think is going to be necessary, and I'm certainly willing to explore alternatives if anyone wants to suggest them, is that what's going on here is a reciprocal interaction, something like the following. So when arm is dictated while there's still the graphemes being activated from bench, the arm lexeme may initially be activated, and it in turn activates the AR and M. But then we have feedback from the grapheme level to the lexeme level, and that will activate arm again, but it will also activate words that share all of these other letters too, among them amber. And then as the activation circulates, we may have these letters and lexemes reinforcing one another, and at least sometimes you may end up having amber more strongly activated than arm and used as the basis for the response. So this account allows us to explain why lexemes are activated that systematically share letters with prior responses because the persisting activation of the graphemes is feeding back up to the lexeme level. Okay. And we get amber from that. So what I think this argues, or what I want to suggest that we can conclude from it, is that certainly in the case of CM, there is feedback from the grapheme to the lexeme level. Because he has brain damage and his graphemes don't deactivate like they should, this leads to some problems for him, in part leading to particular types of lexical errors. But we would assume that if there is this feedback in CM, then this is something that also occurs in the normal system, although probably not leading to these types of errors. So it suggests that at least at these levels of representation, there's this interactive process such that activation at one level reinforces activation at other levels, and the achieving of a final representation of lexemes, graphemes, and so forth is a highly interactive process. Okay. I'm now going to shift gears to a totally different topic, so if there's anything you want to ask before I go on. Yes?
Throughout these experiments, you made a statement in the beginning that this person's CM, his ability to comprehend what was dictated
Right.
was not affected.
That's right.
Can you tell us how that was assessed? And because some of the errors I'm thinking could simply be he misheard the word.
Yes, that's right. They certainly could be.
That's another connection as a result.
That's right, and that's something that you always want to worry about, of course, when you're doing anything with a patient. There are lots of different things that have to go right in order to get the answer right, and there are lots of different ways to go wrong. There are various ways we can test his word comprehension, including their standardized tests where, say, a word is dictated and there's a series of 4 pictures, and the patient has to point to the picture that goes with it. And the test we use is called the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. It starts out with really simple words like ball, but it gets very nasty later on with things like laciniate and manumit and so forth. And so he was perfectly normal on this. Okay.
And it's not like there's a certain percentage of error which you want to remove from your lexicon.
No, I mean he's really fine at this. Also, what we usually do with patients is to ask them to repeat the word after it's dictated to make sure they haven't misheard it. We did that with some of, and then write it, and in fact then repeat it again just to make sure they've still retained it. We didn't do that with him on all the trials because he can't speak very well, but he can speak well enough to repeat words, so we did it for some of the lists, and he had no difficulty doing it. Okay, but it's an excellent question. Yeah. Okay. Uh-huh.
Is there some allowance for, I mean, at least from the data you presented, he seems to be more likely to get the first right?
Yes.
So, maybe some allowance for that, or again, do you have an explanation?
That's a very common type of finding, that even in patients who are severely impaired in spelling, often the beginning of the word is retained correctly. For some patients who seem to have similar types of deficits, the beginning and the end will be pretty good, and it's the middle that's really bad. In his case, he got progressively worse from the beginning to the end. And I'm not sure why that was. It may have had to do with build-up of activation of things. Who knows? I mean, I'd just be waving my hands if I said. The general notion, though, is that, well, there are a couple of types of interpretations that are given. One is just that the beginnings of words are very important for word recognition, at least, and so that you may just, in some sense, know them better. And so that if you have brain damage that kind of weakens your knowledge, it may hurt the beginning of the word less than the end. Another notion is that when you activate a set of graphemes, they then have to remain active while you're doing subsequent processing and writing. And if you have trouble maintaining this activation in a nice clean state, you may be okay on the first letters because you get them out quickly, but as you're working and time is passing, you do worse later on. But the analysis of the persistence effect and so forth took that into account because, say, when we were estimating chance, we were assuming that an error occurred at the position where it actually occurred and asked how it could have come out. Yeah.
Could you test whether it was an issue of maintaining a stable state by having a delay for 30 seconds and then writing?
Yeah, I think that would be an interesting thing to do. And in fact, we did not do anything like this with him. So I don't know whether the intrusions took place over a certain number of preceding trials, or if they took place over a certain amount of time. So if we'd made him go twice as slow, whether there would have been less effect of trials -3 and 4 and 5. So I just don't know. When you ask somebody just to delay making an individual response, there are lots of different things that could happen, right? So if I say the word dog to you and ask you to write it 10 minutes later, you don't necessarily have to maintain any graphemes in any activated state for 10 minutes. You could just remember, the lexeme at a phonological level or orthographic level or so forth. So you just don't have much control over what's being maintained. Mm-hmm.
Did you only try each word once and all consonants?
No, most of these lists we ended up giving to him multiple times. And are you asking?
In the same order each time?
No, they're given in different orders, different times. Yeah, and he was not consistent, so that sometimes he would spell a word correctly, sometimes he'd spell it wrong, sometimes he'd spell it wrong one way, sometimes another way. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Another question about this feedback from the graphemic representation back to the lexicon.
Mm-hmm.
I'm concerned about one other alternative explanation which may not involve feedback.
Okay.
And that has
You
to
wanna go
do
back to it?
with, I guess, the graphemic equivalent of phonotactics. Meaning, after all, I'm used to writing certain letter sequences one after the other. So if you gave me, ARM with high activation and you threw in some B and E, I'm
Right.
more likely to produce
Amber than you are to
Amber
produce
than
BMA. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, that's a good point, and that, in fact, was something that was taken into account in the analysis that I didn't go into. When we were trying to figure out what errors could have occurred by chance, there were two additional things we did. One was that he showed a regularity that many other patients showed too. When he substituted letters, the substitutions preserved consonant vowel status. So when he substituted for a consonant, he put in another consonant. When he substituted for a vowel, he put in other vowels. So that when we were looking at possible substitutions, when it was a consonant that was substituted, we only considered possible consonants. So this is why these all happen to be consonants up here and there are no vowels. The second thing we did, though, is that his responses are orthotactically legal almost all the time. So he would never end up, say, for grim, he would never end up substituting a B for the R to produce GBIM, okay? So that when we first decided what letters were possible candidates for substitution and substituted them in, we then threw out anything that would be orthotactically unacceptable. And that way we're only looking at errors that would conform to those kinds of constraints.
37 is factoring all.
That's factoring all that in. That's right. That's right. That's very, very good questions. Okay. All right. Let me then go on to this other study, which is a little bit different. And that has to do with top-down influences in reading. This is much less formal and quantitative. This involves not a stroke patient, but in fact an undergraduate student here. And her initials are AH. She's not an undergraduate student anymore. She was a while ago. But at the end of the study, she was 21 years old. We started with her early in her undergraduate career. She does not have any detectable neuropathology, so she has no history of neurological illness or injury. Neurological exam and structural MRI were normal. However, it's clear from what I'll show you that she does have some neurological abnormality. It's probably some abnormality that she was born with that takes the form not of some hole in her brain that you can see on MRI, but some other kind of brain development abnormality. Now, this young woman functions just fine. She did well as an undergraduate here, although throughout her schooling she did have difficulty with some subjects, notably math and spelling. And so, if you talk to her parents or teachers, they'll say, well, yeah, we thought she had a learning disability, but it was never really pursued because it didn't seem to be that much of a problem. If we look at her reading, it initially seems perfectly good. So if we look at her reading of text, it seems to be normal. And what I'm going to do is play you a series of short videotape segments here so you can see various aspects of her reading. The first thing you'll see is her reading this paragraph. She's just asked to read it as quickly as possible when it's shown to her on a video screen. And the video here doesn't matter. It's just what you want to listen to what she's saying. I hope you'll be able to hear it.
People on Easter Island tell stories about their famous statues. One story is about the maker of the statues. Called long years, they were led by great chiefs. Thousands of years ago, they first came to Easter Island. They sailed from the place east of...
Can you hear that? Okay. All right, so I hope you can see that she doesn't seem to be dyslexic. She seemed to read okay. So I was very surprised to find that when she was given isolated words to read, she did very, very poorly. So on one task, she was given 144 high-frequency words, fairly high frequency anyway, like dog or sun or apple. And these are words, of course, that the average fourth grader, much less the average Hopkins undergraduate, can read without any difficulty. But she made 12% errors. And these included errors on very, very simple words. And there were two main types of errors that accounted for most of them. In one type of error, like reading dog as bog or lamp as lamb, it looked like she was having trouble with the orientation of letters, so that she was confusing a letter that made a different letter if you changed its left-right or up-down orientation. So, for example, the D and the B in dog and bog, or the P and the B in lamp and lamb. These are sort of stereotypical dyslexic errors, although, by the way, most developmental dyslexics don't make a whole lot of them. The other type I'll call letter sequence errors, which is a fancy way of saying that she got the letters out of order, it looked like. So this would be reading snail as nails or arm as ram. Okay. Now, one thing we can wonder is where in the process of reading these words aloud the errors are arising. And so one way we can find that out, to some degree at least, is to ask her to define the words. And so what we see when she reads a word incorrectly and asks to define it either before or after she reads it, she consistently defines the word that she read. So when she read dog as bog, she defined it as a murky swamp. This suggests that the process is going wrong prior to accessing the meaning of the word. So it's probably in the perceptual processing of the visual stimuli. And I'll give you more evidence of that. All right, in addition to this problem with isolated words, if we give her just random sequences of words on a line, she has trouble with that too. And so I want you to hear her reading this. Again, it's presented on the monitor, and she's just asked to read the words line by line.
After sun, bad, day, call, boy, member, fix, slight, port, count, air, answer, that, today, side, mat, family, beat, wife, look.
Okay. So, and she has no idea she's doing this. As far as she knows, she's doing just fine. And as you can see, she's getting the words out of order. Okay, so the questions this raises are, first, why is she so impaired in reading these isolated words and these sequences of unrelated words? And how can she nevertheless read text so well? I want to focus mostly on the second one, but I need to explain the answer to the first one initially. The answer is that she is very severely impaired in perceiving the location and orientation of visual stimuli. When she looks at something, she often misperceives where it is and how it's oriented. And we can see this in what seem to be very, very simple tasks. So just as one example, we did a task with her where she looked at a computer screen and an X was shown at either the top of the screen, the bottom of the screen, the left of the screen, or the right of the screen. And all she had to do was indicate where it was by saying left, right, up, down, or in different versions of the task, by moving a mouse, say moving the mouse to the right if it was on the right. And of course, this is a trivially easy task. Why even bother to do something like this? But she is very impaired at it, and she makes very systematic errors. First, she tends to confuse the left and right locations. If something's presented on the left, she may indicate it's on the right, or vice versa. And in fact, she did that about half of the time. She also has trouble with the up and down, so that when it was at the top of the screen, she would report it being at the bottom and vice versa about a third of the time. Okay, so this is a very profound impairment. Similarly, if we test her on perception of orientation with visual stimuli, say by having to indicate whether an arrowhead is pointing to the right or to the left, she makes about 40% errors on that. And this is a very high error rate, of course, given that 50% would be guessing. We can see this type of problem in other sorts of tasks. In this task, she's shown a design of some kind and is simply asked to make a copy of it with pencil and paper, with the design remaining in front of her at all times. She doesn't have to remember it. It's right there for her to look at. And even when she's drawing her design right underneath the first one, she will frequently do things like this, where she's drawn all the shapes correctly in this case, but she's gotten them out of order. This may look a little reminiscent of getting the letters out of order in a word. Or she will make errors of orientation. She sat there and drew this picture, not a bad drawing, except it's left, right, reverse. Again, with the picture, the stimulus picture in front of her at all times. So we've done extensive testing with her, and it's clear that this is a deficit of visual perception, that she is quite literally seeing things at a different location and orientation often than they are. So this, of course, is a very interesting topic in and of itself, but what I want to look at here is the relevance for her reading. So the answer for the first question of why she's impaired with isolated words and sequence of words is that she's not seeing the letters and words accurately. She's misperceiving their orientation, their order within a word, and probably misperceiving the locations of words relative to one another as well. Okay. So then the question is, how can she nevertheless read text so well? Her visual system is apparently giving her reading processes quite disrupted input. And in fact, I'll show you later on just how disrupted it is. Yet she's nevertheless managing to read okay. The answer to this, I'm sure you can all figure out, I want to suggest, is that she's making use of top-down influences available as a result of the various kinds of redundancies present in language. And I call these collectively knowledge-based constraints. So that if you think about, if you're reading along and you're reading this phrase, the horses, and then there's H-O-O, even without any visual information about this next letter, you can make very good guesses as to what it is. So you can rely on orthotactics, which will suggest it's pretty unlikely to be a vowel and much more likely to be a consonant. Syntax, which suggests that this is probably, say, not a preposition or an article. It might be an adjective or a noun. Lexical knowledge, which tells you, well, the sequences H-O-O-P and H-O-O-F are words, whereas something like H-O-O-G is not a word. And, of course, general world knowledge, which would tell you if we're talking about something belonging to a horse, probably hoof is much more likely than hoop. So through the use of this kind of information, I want to suggest AH is able to overcome the problem she has. So the argument then is that processing of visual information and reading is not strictly bottom-up, working from the visual information to the identification of the words and so forth. Rather, it's top-down influences reflecting these kinds of constraints interact with the visual information in computing such things as orientation of letters, and order of words, so that these top-down effects allow AH to read effectively despite her severe deficit. Now, what I want to suggest is that this kind of interactivity, these top-down influences interacting with bottom-up processing, are probably characteristic of normal reading. AH probably weights much more heavily the top-down influences because the bottom-up information is not good. So I want to show you a few results testing this interpretation. The first one of them is that when we see that she does well reading connected text, it's not because there's anything magic about text per se. It's just that those constraints, that redundancy is available for her to make use of. So that if we create situations, even with meaningful material, where these constraints are insufficient, we expect her to show impairment. Okay, so here's what we did. We made up some simple sentences like the Smiths moved from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. Now, if I took these words and scrambled them all up for you, you could probably figure out what the sentence was, except for one part of it. In the absence of some other information, you would have no way of knowing whether it should say Pittsburgh to Philadelphia or Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. So the prediction was that although A.H. would read this sentence as if it were syntactically well-formed and meaningful, she might have difficulty knowing whether it said Pittsburgh to Philadelphia or Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, because the sorts of information that I'm suggesting she uses are not available. So we might expect her to make an error like reading it as the Smiths moved from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, at least some of the time. So we made up a bunch of these sentences and had her read them. We also presented them to normal control subjects, and these were Hopkins undergraduates, and you'll be pleased to know that they did not make errors like this. However, A.H. misordered those critical words on about a fourth of the trials. So reading even simple sentences like that. She did misread the one about Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Another example is at the party, Mary gave John a birthday present. She read as, at the party, John gave Mary a birthday present. My husband's mother is in town for the game as my mother's husband is in town for the game. Notice she maintained the possessive where it should be there. So it's not that she's magically good at meaningful material. It's that when she doesn't have the necessary constraints from other than the visual information, she is subject to making errors. All right, the second study I want to tell you about involved reading paragraphs, and I need you to help me here to illustrate how this worked. So I'm going to show a very short paragraph up on the screen here, and when you see it, I want you to read it aloud. Okay, and I know you can do this. Don't be shy, okay?
I had a quick question about the previous one. Was she memorizing the sentence, or did she have it in front of her and just had to
No, it's had it in front of her, and she had to read it. Okay?
Oh,
So
this is the transcript of what she read.
yes. So
Okay.
she was looking at this, and that's, sorry, I do this all the time. It's, point to the screen. You can't see it too well, right? So she was shown at the party, Mary gave John a birthday present. She said at the party, John gave Mary the birthday. And we also asked her comprehension questions to see if she had understood it the way she read it. And yes, indeed, she has. Okay? So she's misunderstood it as well as misreading it. Okay. All right. You've delayed the inevitable, but not eliminated it. So I want you to read this paragraph aloud for me. Okay. My undergraduate classes do better than this, let me tell you. All right, thank you. All right, I want you to try one more. See if you can do a little better this time, please. Okay, I can't stand to listen to it anymore. That's enough. Okay, thank you. All right, so did you notice anything wrong or unusual about this paragraph, right? It's got lots of words out of order. So when normal individuals read these, they do notice there's something wrong with them, obviously. And if they're asked to read them the way that they're written, they can do that reasonably well. Now, the strategy here was that what we were thinking we were doing was introducing into the text some of the same sorts of errors, or at least one of the types of errors that AH's visual system introduces all by itself. So the prediction was, I don't have it written down, the prediction was that she would probably correct for the errors that were actually in the text, as well as the errors that were introduced by her visual system. Okay, so I'm going to show you what happened when she read these. This experiment was done in a fancy device called a scanning laser ophthalmoscope, in which she's looking into a device and her retina is bathed in infrared light, and the stimulus is painted on her retina with a low energy laser. That's totally irrelevant for this. You just want to pay attention to what she's saying. She's keeping her head in a chin rest because the device loses alignment if you move your head too much, so she sounds kind of funny when she's reading, and that's why she sounds like that. So you'll first see her read this paragraph, or hear her read this paragraph, and then the other one.
I sent the maid away and began some of my work. I thought of
of going out, but my uncle would have been angry at my absence. My task was done at the end of the hour. I lit my pipe and sat myself in the armchair. I began to think about my uncle walking along the road, talking to himself.
Okay, not bad, right?
All right.
Now this is the next one.
David ran quickly downstairs, and it was almost Wednesday, and most of the boys had gone into the village. David was not allowed to follow. He looked at the boys that were left in the room and realized that it was going to be difficult to get anyone to go with him. David knew that he was the most.
Okay. And she had no idea there was anything wrong with that paragraph. If we look over a set of these paragraphs, ask control subjects to read them, and look for each time where we reverse the word order, the control subjects have a little bit of trouble. 72% of the time they accurately read it with the word order wrong. 24% of the time they corrected the word order spontaneously, but in all cases they then corrected themselves and said, no, what it actually says is. And 4% of the time they made another error. So even with the normal subjects, you see there's probably some effect of making use of what you know about language. For AH, though, she only read 5% of them the way they were actually written, with the words out of order. 85% of the time she spontaneously corrected the word order, and 10% of the time she made another error. And in no case was she aware that there was anything wrong with the text. So the interpretation, of course, is that this is the sort of thing she has to do all the time in reading because her visual system messes up the word order, and so she has no way of knowing whether the error is in the text or whether it's something that her visual system has done. By the way, she's not aware of doing this kind of stuff while she's reading. Also, as I've said, she feels that she reads well and doesn't really have any trouble and is not aware of trying to work things out. All right, I'm going to show you one last thing, and because I know it's getting late. This is a slightly different type of experiment, but it's along similar lines. In this case, we gave her sentences to read, and we told her that some of these sentences were completely correct, and some of them had various kinds of errors in them, like words out of order, or letters out of order, or letters turned around. And we told her that this time her task was to correct the errors and read it the way it should have been. So in other words, we're asking her to do what we think she normally does anyway. But we also asked her to tell us whether there were any errors in the sentence or not. Okay. So I'll let you try a couple of these. You'll see they're not all that simple. Some of them didn't have many errors. The examples I'll show you did have quite a few errors in them. So take a look at this. And this is supposed to be the young boy took the puppy on long afternoon walks, often stopping to play fetch. Okay? And there's some other ones here too. So you don't have to work them all out now. I'm going to show you now a videotape of AH reading these, and after each one she's going to say, she says fine if she thinks there are no errors in it, and not fine if she thinks there are errors in it. Okay, and so she's seeing each of these sentences for the first time without any previous study.
The young boy took the puppy on long afternoon walks, often stopping to play fetch. It's fine. The agency uses computer models and simulations to predict the effects of human interaction with the bay. It's fine. The stock market is strongly affected by the perceptions of the public. That's fine. The video rental industry will never be able to compete with cable television. That's fine. The computer lab is often busiest during the last week of classes in any given semester. That's fine too.
Okay. So she sometimes, when there were this many errors, she sometimes did notice them, but you'll see that even sometimes when there's just riddled with errors, she's completely unaware of it. Yeah.
I just wanted to know how often she actually did say catch an error.
When there were several different levels of error. So there were some that had only 3 or 4 errors, some that had 7 or 8 errors, some that had 600 and 700 errors. No, not that many. When it just had 1 or 2 errors, she almost never detected them. When there were a moderate number of errors, she detected it maybe a quarter of the time. When there were this many errors, a little over half of the time, I think. So she wasn't totally unable to detect it, but I think it's absolutely remarkable that she could read any of these without noticing that there's error in it.
And what
Okay.
percentage were fine?
I think like a quarter of them were fine. I don't remember the details of it right now. Yeah. I'm not aware. Oh, actually, we did one type of task like this with her. No, I don't think it's exactly what you want. We did a grammaticality judgment task with her where she was given sentences and had to judge whether they were grammatical or not. And the ungrammatical sentences had different kinds of errors in them. Like some had errors of number or gender agreement in them, and others had errors where the word order was wrong and so forth. So certain types of errors, like the number and gender errors, she almost always detected. Errors of the sorts we think her visual system made, like word order errors, she almost never detected. So she could detect certain kinds of errors. Here, the procedure you're talking about will be one that was similar to what we did, but just a little bit different in that she would always know there was an error. In tasks not with language stimuli, but things like when she's making copies of pictures, we have on occasion asked her after she did something to go back and score her responses, or we would tell her, look at this, can you see any difference between this and what you were copying? And she has a very difficult time doing that. She will occasionally see the errors, but more often than not, she won't. Yeah, Luigi?
Did you say she can flip both left to right and up and down?
Yes.
With some of the letters. But she can also do both types of things?
Yes. That's right. So in the case of letters, so she'll confuse M's and W's as well as B's and D's, and she'll make all possible confusions among lowercases B's, D's, P's, and Q's. Okay. Yeah, she has a lot of trouble. Yeah, Ari.
Does she ever show like evidence of having, like, because I assume sometimes if you flip like the B and P and stuff like that, it'll come up with a real word like bug
Correct.
and hug
That's right.
or something like that. Does she ever, like, would she ever read hug as bug and then like, or does the system?
Sure.
So at this.
Well, in isolation, absolutely. I mean, that's what I was showing you before, like reading dog for bog. In context, she would tend not to make those errors as long as the context is sufficient to constrain it. Okay. What we sometimes would see if she was reading a paragraph is she might make a few errors at the very beginning before she had enough time to tell what the topic was. So she might confuse bread and beard if it was right at the beginning of the first sentence, but if it was later on, she would be very unlikely to do that.
So it's interesting because it's not based on, because I can imagine the system sort of having a sense of like maybe the input becomes degraded when it gets flipped somehow, and then because of that it sort of knows
Right.
that it has to correct it as opposed to just taking everything, but it seems to be that since she'll take, that doesn't seem to be the case, I guess, because she'll,
I'm not sure what you're saying. The input is under normal circumstances anyway, the input is almost always degraded. She does not, even with isolated words, she doesn't seem to have any sense of it being degraded. It just is interpreted one way or the other without her awareness. When she's reading text, again, she corrects without really being aware. One thing that was interesting she told us is that after we had done this experiment where she corrected these things spontaneously without realizing it, and we explained to her what she had done, she said, oh, I remember in high school, in English class, we would sometimes read Shakespeare's plays aloud. I would read one of the parts. And I never understood it because my teacher always kept telling me to stop correcting Shakespeare's word order. So she was doing the same thing spontaneously there. Now, there are other parts to this story. As it turns out that there are very interesting conditions under which she accurately perceives location and orientation, when things are moving or presented briefly or flickering. And that's interesting from the perspective of how the visual system is set up. But for reading, if we do things like present words to her briefly or present text or sentences to her flickering on a computer screen, she stops making these sorts of errors. Okay. So we've done these types of sentences I just showed you under strobe light, and she absolutely detects the errors under those conditions. Yeah, Paul?
So if you thought that the kind of syntactic knowledge that was applying top-down and reading was operating on representations that were kind of lowly independent, then you might think that with a much heavier weighting of top-down information that she has to have for reading,
Mm-hmm.
you see that in, also in oral comprehension.
That's possible. That's
Any
possible.
ideas? Is that
We did not test her. We did test her to some degree on ordering with auditory presentation. This deficit I've talked to you about is absolutely visual, because when we test her with non-visual stimuli, she knows where, with sounds or touch or so forth, she knows where they are. But she does have some other deficit too that has to do at least with sequencing of auditory material. So that if she, say, has to do a digit span task where you read a list of digits to her, she has to read them back, she has trouble with that. So I would expect she might have trouble with ordering with auditory presentation for that reason. Although I guess we could one could explore the possibility that the reason she has trouble with those auditory cases is because she's relying too much on top-down information there too. So I think that the short answer to your question is I don't know what would happen. But yeah, it is interesting to know. One thing I do want to suggest here is that this is not operating entirely at a modality-free level, in that this does seem to be affecting what she's aware of visually. So it's not that she looks at it, looks all messed up, and she realizes but she can still figure it out. She very strongly feels that she's looking at it in a particular way, and this is the way all of her vision seems to work, is that it's not the case that she looks at something and says, gee, I don't really know where it is, or I don't know how it's oriented. She looks at it and she sees it as being at a particular place or in a particular orientation. It just turns out not to be there sometimes. So I'm inclined to think that these top-down influences are getting into the level of visual modality representations, but I think in part syntax is determining what she sees, yes. I don't know, how strong a case I could make for that. It's based mostly on the fact that what she's telling us what she's seeing. Whereas you or I could do this task by figuring it out using our knowledge of syntax and so forth. But she's not only doing that, she's not aware that there's anything wrong with it. But yeah, I think.
One control could be, I'm trying to think about company logos and things like that, which are meant to be words and also meant to convey some graphic information.
Mm-hmm.
So there, if you looked at it as a graphic, you wouldn't necessarily try to read it. And I'm trying to think whether there's a good logo that has something reversed, and whether she would then read it correctly.
If you gave her a okay.
eBay was turned backwards.
Oh, actually, that's interesting. This is not at all definitive, but the Toys R Us logo is written with the R backwards. Well, she's entirely unaware that R is backwards. So, I mean, I don't know. I didn't, but so.
I don't know if
Yeah.
you're supposed to make up some.
Yeah. No, I don't know. I can't think of any example like that. Not necessarily, no. She might. Now, see, it depends on what we let her do. You might think from what I've told you that she would be totally disabled, but she does fine. I mean, she went to law school after Hopkins. She's working as a lawyer and so forth. She's devised various strategies, including high-level strategies like obviously using spell checking and so forth when she's writing. But she has a lot of trouble using the phone because when she looks at a phone number, it gets all mixed up. So she does things like, she'll put her two fingers close together and expose the digits one at a time as she's dialing. Conceivably, she could use something like that to help her find some of these sorts of errors. But no, I think for a lot of these sentences, she could look for a very long time and not find them. As in the case of CM spelling words different ways, different times, you know, she'll look at something one time, it'll look one way, she'll look at it another time, it'll look another way. So if she looked at the sentence repeatedly, it would probably look a bunch of different ways to her, and it'd be very confusing. In fact, I mean, she does report stuff like that she just gets, like with call numbers in the library, she just gets so confused. Yeah. So, anyway.
Something like the last sentence on the slide here. For me, it was more difficult to correct it immediately because the two words that are switched, last and the, are actually on separate lines and are spatially very separated.
Uh-huh.
In the case of the cars that she read, were the sentences always on one long line, or was there?
No, they were. I didn't bother to break them. I think these sentences were all on one line, to tell the truth. But the paragraph study I showed you before, the layout you saw on the screen was exactly the same as the layout she saw. And it's a very interesting point because she did make errors that went across lines. Okay, so it's not just that she would consider rearranging words within a line. She was kind of taking in a lot of the stuff and trying to figure out what it could be, I think. So, yeah, she's not limited to the lines.
So when you looked at the eye tracking, because you had her on eye tracking,
Right.
was she processing more of the sentence than normal, than a person without disability before responding?
Not in an obvious way, maybe a little bit more. Okay, so she seemed to make more regressions, as you might expect. And so, yeah, a normal person has what's called an eye-voice span, where your eyes are actually some ways ahead of your mouth if you're reading aloud. There was not anything dramatic there, though, with her. No, she's very, very skilled at this. She's extremely skilled, as you can see. You know, this ability to do these sentences is not magical. This is very hard when you first try it, but if I gave you 15 minutes of practice, you would get pretty good at it, too. But she's been doing this for a long time, and she does it very, very quickly. Okay. So I think maybe the conclusions at this point are pretty obvious, that limited information may suffice because you can use these top-down influences. More generally, just that there are certainly some interactive levels in the language system, and we need to sort out what they are, what this interaction is doing, and what ways it works. And just my other point for you is that studying deficits can give you some insights into normal cognition. Okay, thanks.
This is more of a comment than an actual question. And this grading thing reminds me of an email I got last year, which had all the words with their beginning and ending letters right, and all the letters in between jumbled up. And it was not until I was on the third line that I realized that this is the case. I was reading
Okay.
And he sent the mail, and he also had the same.
The words were okay, but the letters were.
So it's the same length, same letters, beginning and end fixed, everything in between jumbled up. And
You didn't know? Yeah, it may have been particularly that the first and last letters were right that made it harder to see.
I didn't have any problems reading it.
That's really interesting. Of course, we're bad at proofreading because we tend to do these sorts of things. Not as extremely as she does, though. Yeah.
There might be a way to quantify this, because one of the things we do all the time is we build these probabilistic models. So, for example, your modern day speech recognizer has really